Okay, you'd never actually know it because I never made my July anticipated releases video, so you're going to have to just trust me on this, but Masquerade by Sangoyomi was one of my most anticipated books of July, which I think is further supported by the fact that I have already read this book and we're going to sit down and talk about it today in a month that was primed to be my kind of comeback to reading. And instead, I had a lot of personal things that got in the way of that. But amidst all of those personal things, I had this book to keep me company. So, hi, my name is Melody. I talk about books and book-adjacent things on this channel, and most Fridays, I try to dig into one specific book in particular, and I haven't been as good about that this year, I will admit. But that's okay, because we're going to talk about this book today, and we're going to talk about the books when we can talk about the books. Now, this first came on my radar, I want to say last year, when I was still pretending that X could come back from the dumpster fire that it is, and it was described as a West African Hades and Persephone retelling or reimagining, and that definitely caught my attention along with this gorgeous cover. And that is indeed what it is in some ways, and so much more in others. I was definitely drawn to the Hades and Persephone elements, and these elements of Hades and Persephone are definitely evident in the overarching structure of this story. Our protagonist, Ododo, who is a blacksmith, which within the historical context and the world of this book, which is a reimagined medieval West Africa, which 14th, 15th century, so 1400s. Not that I have the full kind of historical knowledge to really know what the differences would be between those two centuries. And that's part of why I enjoyed this book so much as well too, is that historical element combined with the kind of court politicking, which we will get into here in a bit. But our protagonist Ododo, who is a blacksmith, and within this world is also, or blacksmiths are kind of thought of as witches, they are looked down on, but there are these elements where it kind of transposes on the ideas of Persephone and Demeter as her mother and the way that Ododo and her mother's relationship functions within this book. But one day Ododo kind of catches a gentleman's notice, and she thinks that he is just kind of a wanderer, and he turns out to be the Alafan, or the king of Yoruba land, and like a warrior king, and his name is Oremo. And one of the kind of distinguishing things of his rule is that he wears a crown that is also a mask and that hides his face. And so the rule can kind of seamlessly pass through the generations so that for the common folk, it looks like there is one uninterrupted reign. And so he has all of this power, but there is a lot of kind of mythicism and myth built behind the throne as well. And part of this myth kind of ties in to the patriarchal structure of this world as well. And so Ododo enters this world of riches she has never fully fathomed, and also enters a political landscape that is very tenuous in terms of how she is positioned within this world, both because of her past as a blacksmith and how others within Oremo's inner circle receive her, the fact that Oremo's mother does not really accept her, especially as this is positioned as a love match, which is notable because Oremo already has a first wife in Kolo, who is more of a political match and ends up being a friend to Ododo, though there are further kind of complications and tensions between both of these women in context of the world they are living in. And so this is very much a character study of Ododo and how she adapts to this world she is in. And that is part of what I want to talk about here, because there was so much that I loved so dearly about this book, especially when considering the world it was set in and getting to explore that world. But then there were also pieces of it that kind of held me back as a reader, or I think could have pushed further, that sometimes were also related to the world this book was set in. Because I think that this world is so rich and interesting, and especially when we think about the political and interpersonal machinations at play here in terms of Ododo kind of keeping her place and establishing her power as a woman within this world a world in which she is being kind of assessed against her proximity to men's power, and particularly her husband or soon-to-be husband's power, and the way that she is able to kind of establish her own power within her relationship with Aremo, and indicates to him or proves to him that she is able to actually gain a lot of knowledge within the more domestic circles. She hears women talking out on the field every morning while they're going through their morning exercise. She knows a lot more, and women in this world know a lot more than they are given credit for. And with this, Aremo starts pulling her into his world a little bit too, in terms of giving her fighting lessons, which is directly kind of tied to a specific event within the book as well. But there are these kind of moves. And again, we have this kind of exploration of this power, but also in looking at this kind of tied or traced back to the Hades and Persephone myth, we have these themes of death and rebirth. And we see this again in the kind of presentation of the Aliphan. We see this in Adodo, the death of her old life and the awakening of her new life. And we see this repeated throughout the book in a lot of ways, in terms of her life continues to evolve and what that means. And then we're also looking at power, and this also ties into the myth. So there is this really intricate, interesting world built out in this book, and because it is such a character-driven story, we have the opportunity to really explore the kind of slow move of this trajectory, and getting to explore the intricacies and the nuances of this world and this political system that Adodo is being thrust into and learning and adapting to. However, if we look at the length of this, it's not particularly long. It's just over 300 pages, about 336-ish. And so that is neither here nor there. A book can be as long as the book needs to be. We've talked about that before, but I do think there was an opportunity here to further the story. And I do think that this would have benefited from being longer. Additionally, this is told from first person, from Adodo's first person point of view, which did throw me a little bit, because this does have the feeling of a kind of epic fantasy in a lot of ways, though the fantastical elements are really dialed back, even though, is this from Tor? Yes, it's out of an imprint of Tor. But the fantastical elements more deal with the kind of gods at play, and there is a moment in the book where Adodo sees the gods, and the gods are at play in terms of her eating a cowpea, or she sees someone eat a cowpea at the very beginning of the book, and that man is struck down by lightning, and then she, when she is brought in to the Aliphan's world, eats a cowpea in a kind of proving of herself, and that kind of invokes the pomegranate seeds of Hades and Persephone. So there are those parallels, but there aren't as many like fantastical elements as I potentially went in expecting, which was okay, because there were so many nuances of the kind of political system, even within the inner circle of this book, that I thought were just ripe for exploration. But I don't know that the book really took the time to fully flesh those out in a way where the character progression felt natural and kind of sustained, which is really important, because that character progression is everything in this story. We are really following Adodo's journey and her kind of rise and stepping in to power in whatever way that presents for her, which I'm not going to spoil for you. And so it can be frustrating narratively, because we are seeing things through Adodo's point of view, and especially at the beginning of the book, she sees or doesn't see some things that are really frustrating, that are very clearly narratively being set up for some twists later in the book, and never fully grappled with narratively in a way where it feels like the payoff is worth it, because as a reader, I could see them coming from a mile away, and yet the book didn't allow me to kind of explore the characters deeply enough for me to care simply on a character level. And so we had this kind of spoiled moment of this big twist without any of the kind of real emotional depth to it. There were attempts at it, and I did like the relationships and the nuances at relationships this book attempted to set up. I don't know that they were always successful, but I could see the attempt there. For instance, with Adodo and Oremo, their relationship often feels like it is progressing most of the time off page. And I do think there is something to be said. I don't think we as readers or that the author ever wants us to really know Oremo. And there is a distance in terms of this is not a Hades and Persephone retelling in the sense that this is a love story as its main center, which also rings true in the kind of emotional landscape of the book, because as a reader, there are moments of professions of love that never ring true. At the same time, I as a reader don't believe that the character at play really knows what they're feeling at that point. So it doesn't feel disingenuous, but it does feel like there are some moments that are missed. We talk about Adodo and Oremo training off to the side, and we get to see like one scene of it, but we don't get to see this progression of the relationship that adds to the nuance of the way these characters are developing, that then factor more specifically within the larger political schema of the novel, which is where the really interesting explorations are, because there are so many different power plays happening, and some of these big moments end up falling a little flat because there isn't as much reckoning with that nuance. For instance, one of the beginning scenes of Adodo when she is in this world is this big feast. The first time she is being presented to the public as the Oliphant's, I think I've been saying Oliphant's future wife, and one of his major generals publicly protests against this match. And he continues throughout the course of the book to present himself as an obstacle to Adodo, and she doesn't know where a lot of this vitriol is coming from other than him not thinking she is good enough for Oremo. And so this is really reinforced throughout the book, including some of the main turning point action about midway through the book. And yet the kind of resolution of that ends up feeling like a deus ex machina, and it feels like we've spent the whole book essentially setting up this, not rivalry, but this conflict between these two characters, and expecting it to kind of play out or have some kind of coming to a head. And instead, there is more of a deus ex machina moment, which does show another character's loyalty and reveal things about some of the power plays at hand. And yet, while I really relish seeing where that character stood, even that I think could have been built out more. And don't get me wrong, I still very much enjoyed this. The voice was incredibly compelling, and yet I couldn't help thinking about what could have been in terms of how much more this world could have built out, how much more intricate it could have been. And I don't mean that in the sense that it needed to feel longer or denser in any way, but I think that there was a lot of missing nuance and character development that left a lot of the big character jumps that were so vital to the arc of this story feeling a little sudden. And because it's a character-driven novel, that is incredibly important for us to have a sense that we're on the journey with these characters and that we're watching this like kind of slow burn of a change in them, especially because as a reader, for like half of this book, I didn't really have a sense of what we were building toward. So I knew we were just on this journey with Adodo, and I relished getting to explore the political landscape and just the landscape in general of this book. And I would have liked to see that have a little bit more room to breathe. It's also interesting because, like I said, it's first person from Adodo's point of view, which makes sense when she is the character driving the narrative. But for so much of the book, like I said, she doesn't feel like she is driving her narrative. She's very reactionary, which makes sense. But I think her lack of action kind of contributes to not knowing where the story is going. And so if we had really gotten to languish in that a little bit more with her, I think that it would have felt a little bit more fulfilling and the ending would have landed a little harder. The ending was still really good, do not get me wrong, but I think that there was the opportunity to really elevate a lot of this. In some ways, it felt like a really, really polished, thick outline of things because all of the action was there, but some of the emotional scaffolding that needed to support that action wasn't. And it's hard too, because part of Adodo's journey is this journey from ignorance, essentially, into this power and knowledge, but we have to feel like that journey is earned and that the ending kind of moment is earned and that there is that journey there. And instead, again, the voice hid a lot of this. So it's not like it completely took away from my reading experience, but I just felt like there was so much more potential, and I felt a little discouraged in that the book wasn't trusting me, or the publisher, whoever, didn't trust me more as a reader to sit with the story more, because we could have really kind of built out, like I said, I'm kind of just explaining it again because I lost my train of thought. I'm not gonna lie to you. There was the opportunity, we had all of the main pieces, and if we had just gotten to, I don't wanna say fluff it out a little bit because that sounds like it would be superfluous kind of character building or action or what have you, but there were opportunities to really build. Okay, but like I was saying, and I think I found at least a tail of it, probably not the perfect kind of segue. I recognize that we had a challenge in taking a more kind of ignorant character, and we as an audience, as a reader, were following her through her point of view. And so she was going to be limited in her scope of the world. And I think in some ways that was, well, I mean, it was obviously intentional because it was the narrative styling, but I think the intent was to take us on that journey with Adodo, and so we were supposed to be in the dark narratively as well. However, we weren't in the dark narratively for much of it. A lot of the political machinations and maneuverings were fairly obvious to us as readers, or at least to me. And I'm not speaking down on that, but again, I don't think that in and of itself is bad. It's just what else is going on around it and building out these characters that are so interesting. For instance, Aremo, like I mentioned earlier, I think, we didn't, as readers, have a full sense of him, which I think was absolutely intentional. We were supposed to be a little conflicted, I think, about whether we liked him, whether we trusted him, whether we wanted Adodo to love him, and whether we believed that he loved Adodo and what that love was and what it looked like. And I liked that complication and I liked that nuance. However, it felt like we were just dipping our toes there. And that relationship was so complicated and so rife for the internal conflict from Adodo that builds at the end, that I think that if we had really mined that a little bit more, and I don't know that we necessarily needed to get to know Aremo more intimately, but there were these moments of contradiction from him. He would express his love for Adodo, he would give her these lavish gifts, and then he would also make her do really horrific things to prove her loyalty. And so if we had kind of sat with that a little bit more outside of things like the horrific asks feeling like a major action switch, it was absolutely emotionally devastating, but it had the potential to be even more emotionally devastating, if that makes sense. Similar to the nuance in Kolo and Adodo's relationship, which was honestly one of my favorite explorations in the book. And I would have loved to see that developed out even more, that conflict between the two of them and what their roles in society are, the society and the patriarchy they are operating within, and what that forces them to do, what choices that forces them to make, and what that looks like in terms of friendship and where it complicates or challenges their friendship and what that looks like and what the after of that looks like as well. What I did really appreciate this, kind of tracing back to my conversation from the beginning of the year about not being super enthused about Greek retellings that weren't taking any ownership of the story or weren't presenting new perspectives, this absolutely breathed life. Breathed? Yeah, I think. Life, ironically enough, I guess, into the Hades and Persephone myth, which has been incredibly popular over especially the last couple of years, for good reason. It's an incredibly compelling story, but this manages to present it in ways where we can see, like I said, those echoes, and we can see where things are kind of transposed on in terms of the commentary or how it is in conversation with the original story. You know, I love talking about how things are in conversation with each other, but then it is completely its own story, and it takes such ownership of that story and such ownership of the interpretation of the myth as well, in a way that I really enjoyed. Additionally, even though I felt like there were opportunities, and in some ways like we should have explored this world a little bit more, pushed the bounds of this world a little bit more, I absolutely loved what we did get to explore. The kind of setting of this was incredibly evocative. I loved kind of the structure it explored in terms of the politics, but also just the place, and everything felt very immediate. And it was a historical fiction and a light historical fantasy in some ways. Again, the fantastical elements were very minimal here if you are going in for fantastical elements. But I loved getting to explore this world, and I loved such a rich, vibrant world and historical world being presented outside of what we are usually presented from, particularly medieval historicals. And I definitely would eat up more historical fiction from this period, from this world, if possible, but from this kind of exploration of reimagined West Africa in the medieval ages. Middle Ages, medieval period, however we want to phrase it. Additionally, like I said, I did really enjoy the voice of this. I think the voice masked a lot of these issues, and I think that it is an excellent debut. And I think for a debut, this book illustrates a lot of promise from Sangoyomi, and I think it's important to remember that this is a debut and that there's so much potential here. And so while there were parts of it that I could see potential in how it could have been developed more or differently, again, one, it's personal preference. There is also something to be said, I think, about short, punchy books being really popular right now, and I see the appeal of that as well. Again, I personally disagree with that sometimes if it is skipping those emotional beats to back up the action. I feel like the character work needs to be there. It can't just be the action for the sake of the action, and I feel like we did skip some of those moments here. However, I do still think there's a lot of promise here in terms of the rest of her career, and I also still very much enjoyed my time. If anything, I do think it could be kind of traced back to a commentary on like where the state of editing is right now, not in terms of honing things in, but allowing the world to flesh itself out and giving writers that space and direction to kind of further develop their worlds. But that being said, I really loved this world and I would like to see more of it. If you've read this, I would love to hear your thoughts. As usual, thank you for hanging out and listening to mine. If they weren't as articulate as usual or as I would like them to be, I'm going to blame it on the breaks between reviews this year. But again, thank you for being here. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.